Next thing I'm going to talk about is a way to get definition beyond the pixel count. Before I describe two ways of doing that, I want you to understand, I want to describe a couple things that are being done already so you won't confuse them. The first thing is something that astronomers first and then the military started doing, and that was to take multiple exposures and create sandwiches of them. And it really didn't increase definition, but what it did do was it gave them images where there were optical disturbances. And by taking multiple pictures, they get a clearer image than you would get in a single shot. Now, the second thing that is being done is people, and this one does increase definition, resolution. They will take multiple images and vibrate the camera or the lens. And by doing so, there are just little shifts between the pixels of the image, and the software kind of goes through that and figures out where the edges really are, and that does give you an enhanced image with better edge detail on everything in the picture. One problem with that is vibrations aren't always very consistent. So those are two things that are being done. I've noticed when I've described this to people, a lot of times they get confused, say, well, that's already being done. Don't think it is the thing that I'm going to describe to you now. Now, to get this, I'm going to refresh you a little bit, and I'm going to show you a mock-up of a curved digital sensor. Now, this one's a little exaggerated, and again, it might be 5 rows, not 3 rows. Might be 2 rows around the center, it might be 1 row around the center, it might be 6, 8 rows, who knows? That'll be up to the manufacturing and the research people to decide. Now, just a refresher, there are 20 mini sensors in here. Let's say, for example, that there are 20 megapixels in that center sensor, the blue one. Now let's say the second row, each of those are 2.5 megapixels. We would use the center sensor only for telephoto, and that'd give us 20 megapixel telephoto shots, pretty superb. Then when we open up to the second row, and we might go in between, but let's keep it simple. We open up to the second row, and if those are 2.5 megapixel sensors, then we've got a 22.5 megapixel picture. If we compress the center one down, we might not, but for storage and processing speed and convenience, we might compress the center since we don't need that much detail in the center for a normal perspective shot. Okay, third row, let's say that those are 1 megapixel each. Once again, compress the second row and the center row to 1 megapixel, and you got a 25 megapixel wide-angle image. Now, as you might recall from the earlier presentations, what we're proposing to do is do double exposures, and that fills in the gaps between each of these mini sensors, makes production easier, allows for gaps between the mini sensors. Because the center sensor is the only extremely dense mini sensor, your costs get a lot better. These outer ones, which are the most numerous, are very, very easy to make because they're the least dense. So we do have a pretty economic project here. Now, let's remember, difference in size so that they fit easily. We have the outer ones, and then we have the medium ones, and in this example we have the center, the telephoto ones. I want to give you one more crazy thought. Because the outer ones are less densely pixelated, we can make those pixels bigger. And when we make them bigger, guess what we can do? Instead of just going back and forth, we could rotate this constantly. Then we wouldn't have the vibrations from going back and forth. And since the outer rows are bigger, we're moving the same number of pixels at the outer edge as we are in the inner edge, or fairly close to it. That way we can take multiple exposures. Let's say, for example, that in 1/1000th of a degree of rotation, that we move an average of half a pixel across all 3 rows. Now, I'm oversimplifying, but let's just make that assumption. If we do that, we get twice the resolution because we got an exposure at 1 pixel and then at a half a pixel. It might be 1 pixel and then a pixel and a half, or 1 pixel and then 10.5 pixels. The concept is what counts. Now, let me tell you one problem with that, and that is this. What we have gained there is resolution, but it's resolution in one dimension, and that is a radial dimension. It's like the spokes of a wheel, where we're really gaining it. We're not gaining resolution in the concentric directions. So a way to solve that, and I don't know if you can see this, but is instead of having the pixels lined up in straight rows as they rotate, have them angle slightly. That way, each additional exposure picks up a little more detail in a concentric direction, and you now have both the x-axis and the y-axis picking up more edge detail. That's the second way of boosting definition well beyond the pixel count. The most important thing for you to think about is, do any of these ideas make sense to you? And if they don't, what if it makes sense to a competitor? Would that affect your business? Well, it might, and it might in a positive way. Your competitor might throw a lot of assets and resources into developing one of these ideas only to discover that it doesn't work. Sometimes doing nothing pays off. On the other hand, if a competitor does that and they do get a curve sensor to work, they'll have quite an advantage over you, and it would be interesting to see if you can survive a decade. Now, I told you earlier, or I asked you, excuse me, to remember the name Dean Peterson, and here's why. Dean invented the Instamatic at Kodak. His wife developed an asthmatic condition, so he moved to Denver, where we had the Honeywell Photo Products division. We did electronic flash, and we did Pentax and roll-eye cameras and a slide projector and some things like that. Long time ago. My knowledge is very dated. One day we decided for survival we needed to develop our own camera, and Dean came to me and he said, "We figured out a way to make it focus automatically." Wow. I killed the camera. I was head director of the division, and I told him to go just after autofocus, and we did, and they did it. Now, here's where the story gets kind of pathetic and sad. I left Denver, flew around the world trying to sell autofocus to camera companies. This was in the 70s, and I failed. I couldn't get anybody to pay attention. And that's embarrassing. And Dean and I left. He came with me to California, and we started a toy company. Dean did a tape recorder that became the largest seller in the world for a few years for kids, and we had a lot of fun doing that. But then our old employer, Honeywell, in 1992 sued Minolta for infringing on the autofocus patents. Now, those of you who've been in the industry a long time, I haven't, I left, but those of you who were in the industry then will remember that Minolta was the #1 selling camera in the world in 1992 and 1993. They did some good moves and they worked their way up, and they dominated. They were ahead of Nikon, Canon, Pentax. Actually, Pentax had been the prior leader. Nikon always pretty steady in there. Canon was nowhere back then. Things always change, huh? And Pentax had been eclipsed after our departure. And so Minolta flew 3 law firms from Manhattan out to the La Jolla Hyatt. La Jolla is the village I live in, for Dean's and my convenience, and they just interrogated us and took depositions, and they were fighting this seriously because it was an important patent case. Minolta lost. They had to pay $123 million in 1993 to Honeywell for past royalties due on the autofocus patent. Pretty soon the others all tumbled in, and Honeywell collected $500 million that year, 1993, on autofocus royalties. Now, I want you to know I'm no dummy. I got $31 for my gas mileage expense in my testimony, and that testimony went on and on and on. So some people viewed what we did there as a victory. I view it as an embarrassment because I failed to sell it. This one, curve sensor, I might be right, I might be wrong. I'm thinking it's bigger than autofocus, and I'm going to sell it. Now, what the result of that is to somebody, I have no idea. It could be for the better, it could be for the worse, but I think it merits serious consideration on your part. Okay, now I'm going to close and be very presumptuous. I'm going to tell you what I think a logical decision process would be to go through. And that is just this. I think you need to ask yourself 4 questions. The first one is, are you interested or not? Very basic. And if you're interested, are you interested in the way of bending silicon, or in one of our other patents on machining silicon, or in the facets or the mini sensors that are put together to form a nearly curved, perfectly curved sensor? Now, these lead to other decisions. If you want to bend, would you prefer to do the petals, as one of our patents shows, or would you prefer to do the fiberglass, or do you like the idea of heating the surface to make the bending possible? Machining is pretty straightforward. If you want to do the facets, you need to think about how many, and this is where you'll get into discussions with where your optical guys will want about 100 rows of sensors, and your fab guys will want 1 or 2 rows. And somewhere within those discussions, hopefully a rational thing comes out. But then there are 2 more decisions. As in the prior discussions, do you want to move the sensor to fill in the gaps, or do you want to move the image as we described and do double exposures? Those are both pretty credible ways, probably. Now, if you're not interested, thank you for listening. I'm sorry I took up your time. Just kind of ask yourself if you think any of your competitors that are credible and that have capacity to be a force in the marketplace, whether they are now or not, whether they could be, if they make one of these things work. That's a thing that you have to decide. Next question, I think it would be very presumptuous of me to try to suggest what that ought to be, because you guys talk about it every day and I don't. Third thing will be, do you want to go smaller yet? Even smaller, smaller, smaller? There is such a drive towards being small. Now you can go tinier yet with a concave sensor, which means thinner yet, and the concave sensor makes this possible because the lens can be closer to it. It almost nests inside the sensor. But the lost and found people, anywhere you go, will tell you that mobile phones have almost caught up with umbrellas as the #1 lost item. So we may be hitting a point of diminishing returns on thin. If you stay the same thickness, you're going to save battery life, maybe even double it, without changing the size of the battery, because you can use faster lenses, bigger lenses. Faster lenses eliminate the need for flash in dark situations, but they require about the same spacing as you're probably using now in your camera, because they just need a little more optical path. So if you can stay where you are, you could eliminate the need for flash. How's that? The fourth decision, and this is kind of an interesting one, and that is your intellectual property strategy, because as I say it, you have 3 routes, all that are credible, that you can take, and you have to decide what's best for your company and for your shareholders. And one of those might be to study my patents filings, they haven't issued yet, my filings, which I will give to you with no obligation, and figure out a way to design around them so that you don't owe me any royalties. That is a very, very fair business practice. It's a rational thing that you need to do for your shareholders. The second thing you can do is we could negotiate a license. And you could pay a modest royalty and have those patents and be able to block competitors from infringing on them. A third thing, you could do both. You could figure out ways or other ways or enhancements to design around these concepts I've filed on. And you could either then try to dominate the industry, in 10 years own it all, and squeeze everybody else down till they're just struggling. Or you could license everybody and maybe make as much money off your license fees as you do off your basic business. Maybe to avoid conflicts, you drop your basic business. So those are the kind of things that, with less humility than I should have, I propose are things that you should think about. Thanks for paying attention.